joining us for the IEEE Computer Society Standards webinar series, brought to you by the Standards Activities Board. With over 225 standards that transform the way we live, work, and communicate, the IEEE Computer Society sets the standard for design automation, simulation, testing technologies, Ethernet and Wi-Fi, quality assurance processes, systems architecture, DevOps, and more. Standards deliver best practice processes for developing market-ready interoperating systems, products, and services. You can have an impact by joining one of the over 200 IEEE Computer Society Standards working groups. Participating in one of the working groups grants you access to information that reduces risks, increases proficiency, and shapes the future of the industry. Help determine what's next in computing technology. Learn more about our standard working groups at computer.org/standards.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar from our Standards Activities Board webinar series, You Don't Say Standardizing Inclusive Language by Annette Riley. My name is Scott Levine. I'm the membership manager here at the IEEE Computer Society, and I'll be your host and moderator this morning. Before we get started, I would like to address some housekeeping items. This webinar is being recorded. You will receive an email tomorrow, which will include a copy of the slides and the recording. You can ask any questions in the Q&A box you see on your screen. If possible, please reference the slide your question refers to, and Annette will answer as many questions as she can following the presentation. Circling back to today's topic, in December 2020, the IEEE Standards Association Standards Board approved a resolution to avoid non-inclusive and potentially offensive language in IEEE standards. IEEE Standard P3400 is being developed to provide requirements for using inclusive language in all forms of technical material. This webinar considers how terminology emerges for new technology, why some technical language is being identified as non-inclusive, in ways in which people resist change in language. Today, Annette will cover some of the principles behind inclusive language, processes involved in reaching consensus in systematically changing to inclusive language, and practicalities of selecting inclusive terms. As mentioned, joining us today is Annette Riley, a senior life member of IEEE and a fellow of the Society for Technical Communication. Annette now retired from a 31 career at Lockheed Martin, where she held responsibilities for proposal management, engineering management, systems engineering, and information management. She developed technical and management solutions and proposals for major ITC domestic and international government customers. Dr. Riley received a BA from Rice University, a master's and PhD from Brandeis University, and a master's in information science from the George Washington University. Annette is a leader in standards development and in management for over 25 years. She is the technical editor of IEEE P3400, Standards for Use of Inclusive Language in Technical Terminology and Communications. She currently serves as the IEEE Computer Society Vice President for Standards and is a member of the IEEE Standards Association Standards Board and the IEEE Publication Service and Products Board. Annette, thank you so much for being here today, and the floor is yours to get us started.
Thank you, Scott. First, just want to check, can everyone hear me? Okay, great. Let's get started. As we get going, what I'm presenting today is not an official position of IEEE. It's my own opinion. As you've heard, the standard P3400 is under development. Subgroups of the working group have written different clauses in the standard. They've been combined, and the standard has had one edit by me, but has not yet had is in the process of having a full review by the working group members, and their comments will shape the revised draft. Eventually, that revised draft will go to ballot, and when approved, will become an official standard of the IEEE. So the working group has been active for just about a year now. I think we're making good progress, and it's possible the standard will be out before the end of this year. But again, this is an individual view about what's going to be in it when it's done, and about inclusive language in general. So today we're going to be talking about inclusive language. That is, language that's suitable for use and viewing by the widest possible intended audience. Language that doesn't make anyone feel harmed or threatened, to put it in a negative way. We're going to look at what does inclusive language mean for technical communications, and how language includes people or excludes them. Why do people resist changes in language, although language is changing all the time? And then we're going to look through what is currently likely to be in this standard for inclusive language for technical terminology and communication. Language in general is an agreement between the speaker and the listener. If I start babbling and it doesn't correspond to any known human language, we think I'm a baby. Language has to be something that both people understand to be able to express anything, but yet it's an expression of what you feel as much as the strict literal meaning of the words. I can say, yeah, I really agree with you, or I can say, yeah, maybe I don't agree so much. Most words have a denotation that's a dictionary meaning, but they also have connotations, associations that go along with them. And we're going to be seeing how that plays into inclusive language as well. We use language to make metaphors that can be understood or maybe not if they refer to something that's outside the experience of the person hearing the language. And as I said, language is changing all the time. So those characteristics play into what is considered good language, acceptable and inclusive language, and what's deprecated language. Words like hussy and mistress or hacker started out as fine words, but they're not with the same connotation now, or even the same denotation as they had back then. Denotation, heavy metal fan, there's one. Heavy metal fan, there's another. But it's a different sense of the words. And this goes to technical language too. Technical language works in this sense just the same as common language. It uses metaphors when you start to understand something new that's being put into technology. We try to use words that are familiar that the new thing is describing in a way that we can understand compared to things that we already had. File folders, photo albums, and backing up. They're metaphors. So in technical language, we try to just use one word to mean one concept and one definition. You may have learned, I hope not, in writing, vary your vocabulary. Don't use the same terms all the time. Not true for technical communication. We want things to be clearly understood, and that's also very helpful for translation. Consistency is essential if we have a machine-readable language, and the P3400 standard is intended to apply not just to natural languages, but to artificial languages, computer languages as well, because people use words in them that can be non-inclusive and offensive to a person who's looking at the code. Another example of figurative metaphorical language, talking about a platform, working in the cloud, using servers as if it were a restaurant. The items named, there were paper tablets a long time before there were computer tablets. It's impossible to name something new without having it defined or relate to something that we already know. And often words we use in technology are anthropomorphic. We talk about the digital twins. Databases have parent-child relationships. Some of those digital human anthropomorphic terms are fine. It's a way that we express concepts. Some of them are objectionable and non-inclusive. Non-inclusive language is entrenched in technical communication. Here's a patent from 50 years ago talking about a master-slave relationship between the master tape and the slave tape back when reel tapes were the way of storing information, getting information to and from a computer, one step up from punch cards, I guess. A recent patent application, just a few years ago, talks about blacklists. That's, for many people, an offensive term, treating black as if it means something to avoid. Can it be eradicated? I looked up the numbers for this count several years ago. I looked them up again just a few days ago, and the number of IEEE Explore articles using the term master-slave is still growing. IEEE Explore is IEEE's master. There I used the wrong word. It's inclusive archive of journal articles, books, not only by IEEE publications, and there are over 400 IEEE periodical publications, but from other publishers as well, going back, some of them to 1903. And just in the last, since 1951, there have been extensive uses of that objectionable terminology. I will say that since I looked this up a couple of years ago, IEEE no longer has educational courses, webinars that use that term. So efforts are underway to deal with the backlog of non-inclusive terminology that we find now. When you ask people start to change their language, it's not an immediate, oh, sure, we should just do that. Let's make it happen. Can you do that next week? People who've been using language in a long time often find that they're not interested in changing it. It doesn't seem important to them. They need a reason, such as a standard or a regulation, that would encourage them to use more inclusive language. It doesn't seem so bad to me. Those people may need a change, but we're really the authorities on this. Everybody does it. This can be true in an industry. Imagine the situation of changing from non-inclusive to inclusive language is something like changing from traditional measurements to metric SI measurements. IEEE has had a standard for many years that we will use a metric in IEEE journals and communications. And we have style manuals too. But in some areas, such as gauges of screws, traditional measurement is still allowed. It doesn't affect anybody else, but it may need to be done that way if you're not using metric gauge. It is a lot of work to change something that's widely used by industry partners, even standardized, even in regulations and official names. The organization may want to change something, but they can't change it if their customer, who might be a government, is still doing something else. For example, unmanned vehicles. That's the name of the program. And if you want to call it autonomous vehicle or uncrewed vehicle or drone, all of which are in a way unmanned vehicles, you and your customer and the contracts have got to change to make it work across the board. And then people can ridicule something that they just don't see the need to do to make it seem just unlikely that it's going to happen. So why do we need to change the language? Just because you're not offended by something or I'm not offended by something does not mean that it's not offensive to somebody else. It's more important that a term is inoffensive than to try to reach a consensus as to whether something is offensive. In dealing with inclusive language, there's a range of terms involved to be deprecated. Some that almost everybody agrees have a pejorative, a deprecated sense, and some that a few people say that metaphor doesn't sound right to me, but the term sounds right to most other people. So it's not a completely yes, no, okay, not okay scale for a lot of terms as the language changes. I've noticed with the term master, for example, that the real estate agents will no longer show you a house that has a master bedroom. It has an owner's suite or a primary bedroom. That's an example of a term where the connotation has gotten to the point where most people in most senses are accepting that this is a non-inclusive term. It's an example of how language is changing in many areas. So 3 years ago, 2.5 years ago, the IEEE Standards Board recognized that inclusive language was going to be important for IEEE standards, which are done according to an IEEE SA, Standards Association style manual. They wanted to have a policy for it, but the policy that they could agree to and adopt at that time is not hard and fast, never use terms. It recognizes situations that occur. We're going to use inclusive language to communicate technical necessities because it enables market adoption, conformity assessment, interoperability, and other technical needs. It's going to avoid non-inclusive and insensitive terminology and other deprecated terminology. except where required by safety, legal, regulatory, and other similar considerations. So this policy, at the time it was written, and it's still in effect, recognizes that not everything can be changed immediately. But these terms should be avoided. This doesn't say shall, it says should, because as we've seen, there are still standards in IEEE and other standards producing organizations that are still using these terms. So how do we make a change that isn't just a recommendation with a should, but is a imperative with a shall? IEEE solution is to come up with a standard. It's a voluntary standard. That means that if people choose to conform to it, they can say, when it's done and approved, we conform to IEEE P3400. We are using inclusive language in our terminology and communications. So IEEE standards are not just for the language that's used in other standards. I am hoping that when this standard is finished, the Standards Association will adopt the policy that all IEEE standards will conform to this standard, just as we have the policy that we conform to metric measurement or other aspects of registration and conformance. But that's still in the future. Anyway, it's intended for all technical terminology and communications. And that's important because we're not trying to standardize in this standard what ordinary people say in talking together every day among their own community or with other communities. It's intended for technical writing. That includes both standards, professional and technical journal articles, software manuals, hardware manuals, any kind of communication about information technology, other kinds of technology. It has a pretty broad scope. The standard is, according to the Project Authorization Request, PAR or PAR, it applies to the use of the English language. So it's not intended to identify what's non-inclusive language in any of the hundreds of other human languages. But in doing things in English language, we have to be aware that often communications are designed for use beyond the English language, and to consider how the English language terminology is going to work when it's translated. And also, if communications are done in other languages, the principles that we have should apply there if the standard and the user were mainly working with a first language that's not English and actually translating things back to English. So the only part of the standard that really starts out mainly working in English is the clause that has the list of deprecated terms. So it talks about, in this standard, there's going to be, as usual, a scope, definitions to get started at all IEEE standards, and almost all standards do that. There's going to be a set of principles for what makes language inclusive. There's going to be a process for how you can identify and replace non-inclusive deprecated language. And then there is going to be a list of deprecated terminology with recommended replacement terminology, all for the goal of inclusion, a sense of belonging and value belonging to people with a variety of abilities and uses for language. Okay, so in this next part of the presentation, we've moved on from talking about language in general. We're going to be looking at what's included in the draft of P3400. I'm not going to go through all the definitions, and I've sort of given you an indication already of what's in scope for it on that last slide. But here's what's in the principles. There are not just principles for what you do with non-inclusive language. I mean, there's more to the standard that besides saying, don't say that, don't write that word. There's some help in identifying what is inclusive language and what's not. And that's because the standard starts out with a list of terms, but those terms are not going to be fixed forever. They may not include terms that are used in your technical area or your industry. There may be other technical terms that you find are non-exclusive and want to put in. And then as time changes, other terms will be used. So you need general principles so that in applying this standard in a given organization, you can pick up the principles and apply them to other situations. I was impressed and surprised in when the subgroup worked up this clause. They started out by talking about what are just general principles of good technical communication. And I can understand now that if you might write your work, develop your communication so it's understood and usable by the broadest appropriate audience, then that makes it inclusive already. It's not just a matter of searching for a few bad words and trying to work around them. Use terminology that's understandable to the intended audience. Start out by defining the purpose of what you're doing and the intended audience. Generally, purposes are something like to instruct somebody in how to use a product or service, to provide knowledge on a technical topic for an advanced technical audience, or for a general public audience, or for lower level of student, to explain something to the general public that might affect them. So technical communication can be written with a lot of different levels of vocabulary, from mostly using words that are broadly understood to highly technical language for a highly specialized audience. One thing technical communication tries to do that we've mentioned before is to use the same term consistently for the same concept. But in being inclusive, that does not mean that if you're writing technical research material that you have to use imprecise everyday wording. It's perfectly fine to write it at a level that for a non-specialist audience might be considered arcane or jargon, because it's really not aimed or intended to be understood by somebody without technical background in the area. Using examples that are relevant to the audience's experience, or metaphors that are understandable. If I use a metaphor from US baseball, saying, oh, this is out in left field, did you catch that? It may or may not be understood to a global audience. Using accessible communication, accessibility in this sense applies to people who have a broad range of abilities. Some may have vision impairments and rely on screen readers. Some may have hearing impairments and rely on having everything visible. So there's closed captioning for an audio experience. That's a different aspect of inclusive language for what we're talking about today, but it is part of opening up communications to the widest appropriate audience and being aware that the language is going to change. So those are the general principles. We're going now to principles that are specific to avoiding non-inclusive language. First one is understanding that terms with acceptable denotations can have deprecated connotations. A good example of this is the use of the words for colors, black and white. Using inclusive language does not mean that you can't use the name of the color black or the color white or the color gray or red, yellow, other colors. But if the color has a cultural connotation, a racial connotation that associates black with something bad, white with something good, this is not inclusive. And that's what we want to avoid. So in this gradation here, most people would say talking about white matter in the brain is perfectly acceptable because it is pretty much a white color. Now, white noises don't have color. So is that acceptable or not? Black box for testing something that you can't really see. It's just a static test by what is happening on the outside, or white box testing, sometimes now called glass box testing. You can observe dynamically what's going on in the software of the system. I would say there's a gradation, and when we get up to the top two, we're getting to terms that are pretty generally now considered deprecated, not inclusive, and are actually likely to be in the list in P3400. Similarly, a master's degree. I have a couple of them. I don't know that academic institutions are going to change the name of that degree to a first level graduate degree or some other term in the future. But right now, for everybody who's earning one, it's a master's degree. Skills mastery, when it's you that are able to do something at an advanced proficient level, something beyond maybe just competency. In this sense, it's probably acceptable to most people. The terms higher up here go to ones that are pretty generally not accepted as inclusive language, some of which have been used since the beginning of the internet, but are from the beginning of Agile, but are now being recognized as not nearly so accessible and acceptable. Okay, so principles for avoiding non-inclusive language. And by the way, this applies not just to words, but to graphics as well. Words show up in graphics. Before I go any further, I don't know if you have your screen zoomed up to a size where you can read the caption of this picture, but you don't have to tell me. Don't put anything in the chat if you have it. But when you looked at this picture, what did you say? Oh, that's a picture of. Did you say women looking at a computer? Did you say programmers of the ENIAC? This is one of the first programmable computers, and these people in the picture are the programmers who developed the code that would allow the ENIAC to compute trajectories of missiles and other artillery. They were actually human computers. They aren't just nice ladies looking at a piece of technical equipment. When we see something like this, do we characterize people as women first or as programmers first. This is known as using terms that don't unnecessarily limit occupation or human activity by gender. Something that you avoid if you're using inclusive language. Probably the top one on the list is avoiding language that unnecessarily connotes violence, subjugation, domination. Those are things that engage a different part of people's brain. And when they hear them, they are not necessarily focusing on a technical function. So words that turned up in computer code, execute, kill, hang, we're working to find ways to say those in ways that stick to the point of what the computer is doing without connotations of violence. Terms that connote bias or inequity, and this is a very long list. This is even a longer list than it is in the IEEE's own policy on discrimination or encouragement of diversity and inclusion. Using terms that communities and groups of people consider respectful. I don't have to ask you to think of terms that are disparaging of other national groups or racial groups, but sometimes this can be tricky, and if your technical writing is talking about them, how do you call them? It's better to call them by the term that they consider respectful, and that changes over time. Using people-first language, not talking about the homeless or the illiterate or the illegal immigrant, but talking about people-first language, a person experiencing homelessness, a formerly enslaved person, an enslaved person is now considered a more respectful way to talk about people. So the principles give you this guidance for if a term falls into one of these categories and would be considered that way by people who are affected by it, don't use it. I remember when we were discussing the use of the term, and it comes up in many standards, master clock. There's also in some standards the grand master clock. And we were discussing, is that offensive? Is that non-inclusive? A person not from the US, but from Germany said, yes, for me that is not inclusive. And that was one of the factors that led to the decision to consider to include that in our list of deprecated terms. Okay, we've talked about the principles. We're going to go now to the process for implementing inclusive language. This is in the standard to help you. I'm going to start talking a little faster so that I allow time for questions at the end, but I think we're going to finish up with about 10 minutes for questions at the end. Any standard that has the processes in it, there's also a standard for how you describe processes, which is ISO IEC IEEE 24774. I was a co-editor for that one. And it says that a process, you have to explain the purpose and the outcomes of the process. So the purpose is to produce technical communication fit by use for the widest possible intended audience without deprecating or harming people who may use the information. The outcomes of using this process, technical communications contain inclusive language, do not contain deprecated non-inclusive terminology. And you have a process to make this happen. It doesn't just happen by accident. There are people, systems, and processes to identify, annotate, and replace non-inclusive terminology in both new and legacy information. And you have a reference list of deprecated terms and replacement terms that are updated to reflect changes in usage in terms newly recognized as non-inclusive. So you're doing something to keep this going in your organization. This standard is intended to be used by a lot of organizations. And the basic process is pretty simple. Find a deprecated word, replace it. There are different ways to replace it. You can just rewrite the sentence to work around it. There may be a standardized replacement in this standard. If you're using this term in a standard, this is the replacement term that you will use. If you're conforming to that standard, this is the term you will use. Or select a replacement term because different terms can fit different situations. As we've seen with trying to replace unmanned, there are many possibilities that suit what kind of vehicle or what kind of way that there's no man involved in that vehicle. Doing the process in an automated way, you can have a controlled vocabulary, which many industry groups already do. You can have a list of deprecated term stems, and you can go make sure all your content is machine readable, go through it, do an automated search and revise, and then you hope have a review by humans to make sure that what you've written still makes sense and is good in your context and is going to be translatable or usable if you decide to move to another market. So this process is good and useful, say, if your organization acquires all the intellectual property or products of another organization and you have all their technical communications now and you want to see if they're fit for use and make them consistent with yours. Well, to do this, we had to think about, how is this process actually going to work out? It isn't done instantly. There are different kinds of technical communication that are easy or not so easy to make inclusive. New communications, if you're writing something now, you know to avoid things that people will consider non-inclusive. If something is revised frequently, your website, for example, you can update it fairly quickly, and you can take down things that are not considered acceptable. If you're working on software code, it can take a long time to clean up the code, but you can put in comments, this code is deprecated and here's the word that we're going to be using in the future to replace this word that's in the code. If it's in a law or a regulation, that takes some work to convince people that they want to change those. And finally, if it's in an archival, non-revised material, journal articles from 1965, journal articles from 2020, it's very rare that a piece of scholarly writing is retracted. People do try to revise textbooks all the time so that they're considered acceptable in their culture. But scientific and technical research material is not going to be changed that easily. So ways of handling the feasibility of the material can vary quite a bit. Okay, a lot of different people are involved in inclusive language. And the standard is applicable and usable in different ways by all of these. Government organizations, code bodies, industry, standards organizations. Part of IEEE is a standards development organization. It's also an individual member organization of engineers, not a trade association, but has some characteristics of both. We are a publisher. Your suppliers, your producers, your customers, people within the organization are involved in the inclusive language process. You need top management to agree to do this and champion it and make it happen, have people spend the time to do it. The technical communicators, the subject matter experts who decide, all right, if we're not going to call it that, what are we going to call it? And representatives of different cultures and communities who use your material and may find it non-inclusive. So, besides the basic process in the standard, both basic and automated to replace technical language, there are organizational activities described and required in the draft standard to make this happen. First, establish a policy that you're going to do it. Second, set up people who are going to manage the use of inclusive language and transformation. By the way, I'm saying first and second, but typically when you're using a standard, you may be doing all of these in any order and working on all of them at the same time. It's easier if you have a policy in place, but some people do an effort when they only have a style manual or are just relying on the policy that's in the standard rather than their own organizational policy. Establish your own deprecated and replacement terms list. This comes along with surveying your portfolio of technical communication. How much is involved? Some terms that people make a big fuss about and are, offensive, but they never occur in IEEE publications. So the effort to do something about those terms, the need to include them on the list, is negligible. On the other hand, some terms may take a big effort beyond your organization to completely remove and replace. When you do this work, it's not just replace. Somebody has to look at it and make sure it still makes sense, and that the replacement is not just something that sounds like a machine translation and doesn't really fit the context of what you're doing. I remember an example from the early days of machine translation. They translated the verse, "The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak." And the translation was, "The wine is fine, but the meat is spoiled." It just doesn't work. So you have to have humans look at it too. And then working for change with your partners. That's it for the overview of the standard, the type of things that can come up. We're ready now for questions. Do we have any questions, Scott? Scott, I don't hear you.
Oh, sorry about that. I was just saying thank you for a great presentation. Thank you for taking us through the early stages of this new standard. I had one question as I was listening on. I think you did a good job of going through it. What's the process for things that are already established, like as you talked about articles and existing standards. So thank you for addressing that. Let's see. We did get one question that came in. My question, this is from Massimo. Great topic and presentation. My question is related to the usage of English language by English native speakers. I'm Italian with a technical English background. Sometimes some English speakers use vocabulary and sentences that are hard to understand. They don't see any difficulty with this, but sometimes implies ambiguity, wrong understanding, or at least the request to rephrase or additional questions. you have some general advice or rules for native English speakers in these situations?
This standard is not covering conversation even among learned people and scholarly people, technically advanced people. So it's naturally you want to try to avoid non-inclusive terms when you're speaking as well. And so it's really difficult to control the language that people use when they're conversing. But the language that's used in written, recorded audio, technical communication, that we try to use, as we said, a vocabulary where there's one concept, one word, and that's the term that fits that concept. When we go into a new technical area, there's often a period, people often want to standardize the vocabulary before they start standardizing the technology. That's very difficult to do because you have to invent the technology before you know what concepts you need to use it. It all has to work out together. And another case that can be difficult is when people speak different varieties of a language. This could be French Canadian French and French in West Africa. It could be English in the UK and English in the United States. Not just differences in spelling, but this is a technical linguistic term, polysemy. That means two words that mean the same concept. A truck in the US and a lorry in the UK. If you were educated in one of those systems and you are speaking with people from the other system, you may find that even their technical English has variance in it, which is not ideal. So that's about all the help I could give there. And it's all right always to ask people, if you didn't understand, can you say that in a different way?
Yeah, no, that's very true and great advice. Is there, I'm not sure if this is known yet, is there a timeline on when this might be finalized?
Yes, I mentioned that I'm hoping that it might be out for ballot later this year. It depends on, standards can take from 18 months to 10 years to come out. We don't want this one to take 10 years. We do have to get agreement in the working group that we have the content that it needs to have in it, and that the content is presented in the clearest way, and that the list of deprecated terms is accurate. I'm hoping, this is my personal hope, that the terms that are used in standards where a replacement term will be applied, such as master clock or grandmaster clock, that the standards groups responsible for those standards will themselves agree on what term, rather than just saying, here are some alternates that you could consider, because it's very important in a standardized situation that everybody uses the same term. It's not like proprietary language where one company could call it one thing and another company could call it something else, so that you think, oh, they've got something special. Anyway, if everything goes really, really smoothly, we could be voting to put this out for ballot in this summer. And then IEEE ballots can go pretty fast, but you have an initial ballot of usually 30 days. You get back the comments, then you decide how to resolve those comments, and you put out a recirculation, lather, rinse, and repeat until it's done. So I'm thinking, if all goes well, this standard could be published early in 2024. And if it goes at warp speed, it would be done by the end of this year. But I think we're moving along. There are other groups working on standards for inclusive language, and with the hope that ours will be consistent with them or maybe even adopted by other groups. But that depends on the acceptability of what we produce. So we've had an excellent working group involved, people who have this as their main occupation or who contend with technical language from just about all those different organizations that I showed on that slide. And I think we're going to come out with a very commendable product. It won't be perfect because the language is always changing, but we'll have something that IEEE can use. I should point out this standard is from the Standards Association. This is not just a computer society standard, but one from the Standards Association as a whole, because it's intended to be used across all of the different societies and communities in IEEE.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you for that very detailed response. I think this next question, I think, relates to what you said near the end and how it would sort of be a starting point, and it sounds like it's going to be a standard that's going to be constantly updating with new words added. Timothy asks, what steps are you looking at to address language as a moving target? This seems very difficult to predict, perhaps avoiding metaphorical technical terms.
That keeping the deprecated term list up to date, I don't think it's going to be a matter of weekly changes. But over the course of, say, 3 to 5 years, it's likely that some other terms will come in and people will agree in some areas where there's not agreement on what are acceptable replacement terms. So in that way, IEEE standards, once they're published, are good for 10 years, but they can be revised at any point. Another possibility is that collateral products such as code or utilities that can be used with different language, grammar scanners, spelling scanners, can be have this as a built-in part of the standard, and those can be updated by different producers more frequently. So the future maintenance of the standard is dependent on how things go, but it will definitely need revision over the years.
All right, and we'll take this as the last question. This was from Mark. He's curious about the development, what the development process was like. Did the group work towards consensus or towards approval? Was there strong support for changes? What resources were used to determine the list of deprecating terms?
Okay. Let's see. Do I still have one more slide here? Yes. Here's a list of resources that we looked at. Insights is a U.S. group, a U.S. mirror group for the ISO IEC information technology standards area. And they are working on a similar standard, but with a different scope. And they have published guidelines, not a standard, but guidelines, which had similar content. Also in the U.S., the National Institute of Standards and Technology, or NIST, has provided excellent guidance. And other professional societies, American Society for Mechanical Engineers, ASME, ASME, and of course corporate and style guides are out there as well. So here are some of the resources that we used. The process, as I say, started a year ago. The group only meets virtually. We had one sort of a face-to-face kickoff meeting with a few of the members gathered face-to-face, but it's global group. And we decided on we had from the approved project, the scope, purpose, and decided on what the general idea would be, what the approach would be, and split into subgroups that wrote the different clauses for the principles, the process, the vocabulary definitions, and the term list, deprecated term list. And those have just recently been combined and set out for individual working group review. So now we have to see if we do have consensus, as we've been building it over the months when the subgroups reported on what they were doing and what's been put into the first written draft. And so that process of consensus, like all the IEEE standards, is following IEEE Standards Association Operations Manual and Principles of Inclusion. And by the way, the P3400 working group is open. You don't even have to be an IEEE member to join the working group. If you're interested, look for it on IEEE.org. Thank you. I think we may be close to out of time, and I'm sorry if I ran a little bit over.
No, you're perfectly fine, and thank you for your presentation. Thank you for sharing this new standard with us. As a reminder, if you're interested in learning more about the process, this webinar and the set of slides will be emailed out to you, and you'll be able to capture all these links when you download the copy of these slides from your email. Just a quick programming note. You have a few webinars coming up over the next 4-ish to 5 weeks. Our next webinar is from the same Standards Activities Board webinar series. It'll be on May 4th from our very widely known standard 802. It's going to be titled The Journey to 800 gigabit and 1.6 terabit Ethernet. On May 18th, we have from our Build Your Career webinar series, we have Applying Emotional Intelligence Daily. And on May 30th, we have another webinar from the Standards series from the Functional Safety Standards Committee, Results and Perspectives. That webinar is actually going to be based on an article that those authors published in a recent article in our flagship magazine, Computer Magazine. A link for all these webinars will be in the same email you get tomorrow, along with the aforementioned slides and recording. Again, I would like to thank all of you for sharing, asking your great questions. Annette, thank you for being here and sharing your insight with us today. I think everyone appreciated and learned a little bit about the process. And I guess with that, we'll wrap up. Thank you again, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, Scott.